So this morning I'm going to be refuting Alfonso's speech, where his claim was that raising minimum wage will negatively affect the economy. His first supporting claim was that by raising minimum wage, there would be an increase in unemployment. His second supporting claim was that raising minimum wage will not only cost less labor, but it will cause production sales to fall. And his last supporting claim was that raising minimum wage will increase prices and will cause inflation. So on his first supporting claim, he mentioned that the raise of minimum wage would increase unemployment. The evidence that he used was from an article, Minimum Wage, by Richard Berman. However, I wasn't able to find this article, so I made my own research on the author, Richard Berman. And I found that he was a current leader of the Employment Policy Institute. And I read further on, and this institute is an institute that it's a nonprofit firm that is run by a public relations firm that represents the restaurant industry. And if you realize in his speech, he gave 3 different examples and all of them were on restaurants. So I think that using this information, this website or this article, caused him to use only those examples rather than a variety of different ones. His second supporting claim was that minimum wage will cause production sales to fall. He talked about an example by Jim Robinson, who is an owner of a restaurant. So again, like I told you guys, the examples that he was using were mainly just on restaurants. And in this article, it was found in Seattle Times in the editorial and opinion section. So just by knowing that the person who was interviewed is a owner of a restaurant, is a small business, so he could somehow show some bias because he is trying to defend his own business. So, however, I still read the article. I found it and I read it, and even Jim Robinson himself mentions before all the stuff that Alfonso mentioned in his speech. Before that, a different part, Jim Robinson says that controlling the cost from wages is extremely crucial to every small business. He mentions that it's small businesses. He doesn't mention anything else, it's just the small businesses. So he is assuring that this can affect mainly just small businesses, which is why Alfonso only used examples that are small businesses or furthermore just restaurants. Alfonso's third and final supporting claim was that raising minimum wage would increase prices and inflation will be a result of it. He said that if the minimum wage is raised, that the people would have to raise the prices on their products or on their goods. But what he said was that that the gas prices and the food prices will go up. However, these aren't small businesses, and he doesn't go further on mentioning how that could happen, because he didn't have anywhere to get that, I guess. The problem with this is that there is no evidence for it, and the examples that he had mentioned before, again, were in restaurants. And even furthermore, to support this claim, he uses another example of a restaurant where he says that that people in the future will have to buy coffee for $3. But I was thinking, I'm like, how many people already buy coffee for $3? And if they have to buy those goods, they're gonna buy it regardless of the price that it is. For example, if gas prices, they have been going up and people still consume it because they need to, they have a need. So regardless of what the cost is or what their pay is, they have to buy that because it's a need. So when he says that nobody is going to be purchasing these things anymore, it would be a generalization, because you don't know if everybody will. Some people will still do it. And actually, I think most people will still do it because it's a need. Also, if the people get paid more, I guess they would be able to afford the things that they have to buy, regardless of if it's higher or not the price. So in conclusion, raising the minimum wage will affect small businesses. However, it does not mean that it will affect the economy as a whole, because there's other things that the people will still be purchasing. And I did my research on the minimum wage, and it says that the purpose of it was to target those people whose income is below the poverty line. And so far, they have pushed 900,000 people above the poverty line, which means that their target or their purpose for this is actually being met. Like their expectations are being met regardless of what the other things are. And it says that if it weren't like this, people would still be doing this, like they would still be arguing that minimum wage will affect the economy negatively.
All right, well, structural issues are pretty solid. You label the main and the secondary claims, and as you get to each of the individual points, you signpost them well, so that part's fine. The argument on the first point is about the evidence itself that the advocate used, and you basically point out that you had difficulty finding the article, and then so you just basically just tried to identify the source that they are quoting, and it sounds to me like there's sort of an implied criticism of bias because this person represents an industry, but you never come right out and say that. Actually, your argument comes down to the evidence really only just applies to restaurants and it doesn't apply to anything else. And then later on, it's really only small businesses that are affected. And I was trying to figure out why that was important, and then I see kind of at the end of your argument that there's this implied reasoning challenge that because the generalization really is only about small businesses, any arguments that don't fit into that category would not be covered by that generalization. I think I see the way you're trying to apply it there, and if your premise at the beginning was true, I think you'd have a pretty reasonable inference that you're making there. I'm not sure that is, however, the issue. I think in the first part, they are in fact talking about small businesses and restaurants, but I don't think that their argument is that the effect is limited to just those particular places. It just happens to be that those are places that are strongly affected by the minimum wage, and they're the ones that they are concerned with. But I don't know that means that it wouldn't have an effect on any other business that is required to pay minimum wages, particularly large businesses like food or gas or any of those other places that you're talking about. The argument on the second point seems to be that because it's a business and they're defending their business, that there's somehow some kind of bias there. And I'm not quite sure why that is biased. If a business says we're being harmed by this, and we're going to have a negative consequence, there's a question about whether or not there's accuracy on that. I think that might be legitimate, but I'm not exactly sure where the bias issue comes into play. If there was an argument that was going to be presented defending the need for increase in minimum wages, or for example that businesses could afford to pay higher wages, then I think maybe there would be some reason to have that argument. But you never present anything that talks about whether or not there is adequate revenue in these businesses to afford to be able to pay those sorts of things. At the very end, there's an argument that is kind of made in passing that suggests increasing the minimum wage would raise a number of people out of poverty. And I think the citation that you're giving us is the CBO estimate on 900,000. I think that needs to be cited a little bit more effectively. If you're going to make a counterclaim advocating the need for an increase in the minimum wage, I think that you need to develop that a little bit more clearly. There's also another argument that's presented only in passing, and you don't really develop it at all, that says that would increase the purchasing power of people at the lower end, and that would have an economic benefit, which is a counterclaim that I think generally does attack the argument that's being presented here. But you don't really provide any information on that particular point. So there's some mild criticism of what the evidence is that the advocate's using. There's kind of a general challenge to the reasoning process that the advocate used, but I think that challenge is premised on misunderstanding of what their generalization really is, which I think is a little bit problematic for you. All right, thank you.